All right, thank you everyone for staying late in the day. Hopefully this will be the most informative talk you come to of all of Blackhat, all right? And the reason I say that is actually because we're talking about something that we never talk about at Blackhat, which is when we come back to our jobs, we leave from this conference, we have to buy tools and things to help us solve these security issues that we just learned about. And inevitably that means we have to talk to our bosses, executives, et cetera, and try to justify these costs. And so that's what this topic is about, is how to communicate with executive management and talk about security. So a quick thing about me, I'm CEO of Savik Technologies. I've been around the security scene for years. I wrote Nmap for Windows, Snort for Windows, DSNF for Windows, a bunch of other tools. So I've been around for a while and also done a lot of work at the various conferences, pretty much every major conference. What I'm most well known for, though, is writing Hacking Exposed, one of the 6 authors, also author of the new Hacking Exposed that came out last year. So if you still want to buy a book, I'll sign it for you if you go buy one out there at the bookstore. But I've done a lot of work for now Information Week magazine. That's where this topic that we're going to talk about came from. Information Week, I've been doing a lot of different cover stories on more technical related items. And as I was working with a lot of the CSOs and whatnot across the United States, I realized that this topic hadn't been communicated too much or discussed. And so what I did is I started a big survey. And so we spent about 1.5 years researching how do people communicate within their jobs. Over 1,000 companies we worked with. Of those 1,000, over 200 had actually had breaches. And they were in a couple different industries, okay? And so kind of some of the tips and techniques we'll talk about are directly related from these interviews with these CSOs and directors of security and security engineers across the world. So the first thing we did is we said, what are you guys concerned with? And this led into a lot of different interesting conversations, but what was most important about this was that the percentages that you see here. So managing the complexity of security was a huge increase from the previous few years. And we had done some similar surveys like this a couple of years ago, but it's gone up dramatically. And complexity in general, as you can imagine, is getting more complex as more and more networks are getting decentralized and deperimeterized. But the 15% of getting management buy-in is going up as well. We're seeing in the economy there's less investment in security. It was decreased last year. We just saw the Verizon business report, if anybody's read that yesterday that got released. Security breaches went down so far in 2009 and in 2010. So how are you going to go sell your boss on doing security stuff if breaches are down? Right? So a couple different things have been changing, but talking to executives hasn't really changed. So the question that we started asking people is, who are you? How do you manage security? And security metrics started becoming a pretty important topic in about 2005. And a whole whopping 2 books were released about it. And they're actually here at the bookstore. Those are the only 2 books right now that talk about security metrics. And they're very, very deep and detailed. They talk exactly about how to measure these things and monitor them, and they're talking about, your modified annual loss expectancy and how you can do all these different things. Those are great things to start with, but both books, sadly, only dedicate 11 pages to how to communicate those actual metrics you've now collected. So you've got all these great metrics, all this great information about how well you're doing in security, but you don't know how to tell people that. Okay, so I liken this to my 5-year-old son who has got all this great stuff to tell me, and he's just stammering real quick, and he's just breaking up with sentences and whatnot because he can't fully explain what he's trying to get through because he doesn't know the right terms to ask and to talk about. And so when we started looking at these different things, we saw that there really was no commonality. Okay, that was the biggest piece we saw here. Security metrics. There's been a bunch of stuff about this, right? Why aren't people having these frameworks built up and using the same things over and over again? And of the companies that we worked with that we thought were doing the right things, they didn't actually use any common framework. They kind of homegrown it and built it up in their own environment. And the reason it was so successful is because as they homegrown that system, their executives and the rest of the business bought into it because they grew it with them. All right? And so immediately when we talked to the companies that brought in a big framework like an ISO and the metrics that come with that or something like that, business executives were immediately like, whoa, I don't understand that, I don't want to listen. They turned their brains off. Okay? When they started growing it homegrown, they got a lot more success. So all these metrics that are here are actually good, maybe. Okay? They can be good if they're good for your environment. So that's the key here, is that everything needs to be customized. So the first thing that we saw was that Security ends up being a set of very strategic projects, okay? And strategic projects are very difficult in the beginning. They're complex. They're very difficult to communicate. And so on top of that, security can never stop, right? We can't stop doing something. So just because firewalls are no longer, the threats are no longer operating system and the firewall is the only tool you have, you still need firewalls, right? You still need some antivirus and things like that. Everything kind of builds on top of each other. And yet all the security metrics that people work with are point-in-time metrics. They're not focused on longer-term strategies. And so 2005 book, the first one on IT security metrics, written by a gentleman, he talked about the balanced scorecard method. What this balanced scorecard is, and it's a great tool, and that's why I'm bringing it up, but nobody used it in our survey. Not a single company used the balanced scorecard method. What this method is was developed by Harvard to do business strategy. So forget about security, just how do you do big long-term business strategies? Kind of like BP, how are they going to clean up the oil spill? That's a pretty long-term strategy issue. And so they use a balanced scorecard for that type of approach. And so what they did is they adapted the balanced scorecard for security. Okay, and it found it very, very effective because the core tenet of the balanced scorecard method is whatever you're measuring and doing has to link to a business objective, plain and simple. That business objective, if you're a bank, could be to open 4 new branches. It could be gross sales 20% a year. Whatever the business is trying to do, everything from a project perspective has to match to those objectives. If they don't, you shouldn't be doing the project. And so as they started looking at and mapping these technologies to the business objectives, they found out that it was much easier to communicate with executives because now the execs figured out why you're doing it. So if you can link vulnerability management and things like that to some of their business objectives, they don't turn their brains off. Okay, they keep listening because they understand the value much more quickly. The other focus of the balanced scorecard, though, are very defined metrics. Okay, so the rest of those security metric books that I mentioned, they have all the metrics you could ever want. The balanced scorecard helps you figure out which ones are best. And it helps provide accuracy to your claims while not getting you too deep into precision. And we'll talk about the difference between accuracy and precision in a second. But the biggest piece that I wanted to state here is that although no company we talked to was doing the balanced scorecard method, there was a couple that we found through research and things like that. As they were actually doing it, the first thing they told us was, it doesn't always work. Okay, so it's not a one-stop framework that's going to make everything easy for you. Okay, so you got to realize that this, for everything you're trying to do in security, this will not always work. All right, sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. So what do we see? Well, the first things that we heard back from everybody was that basically nobody believes me. Okay, all your assumptions about your value to the company are wrong, is what we found from a security perspective. As an engineer, you already have an uphill battle. Okay. The business is focused on different things. They look at you as an outsider immediately because you weren't in the business. You're an IT guy, so you're a geek, right? And there's all these different stereotypes you have to fight against just to get into the door to explain the project that you have. And it may be the highest risk issue you guys could get broken into tomorrow and everything's stolen, and you still have these uphill battles to deal with. So the first thing we saw when we actually looked at the PowerPoints, we went deep into this. We said, let me see the PowerPoints you're using to justify your projects. Let me see the actual people you're talking to. Is it board of directors? Is it committees? Who is it? First thing we saw is way too many variables. Geeks love variables, and they will go get industry data like crazy and show 18 different intersection points of why this is important because they have to prove this case. It's very difficult to prove this case of a complex project. So we saw that those who were successful, though, removed all the variables. Okay, they made things a lot simpler, and I'll give you an example in a second. But they also focused on reducing precision. Okay, you can see here 0.6, 0.55, 0.61. They don't care. Okay, it's close enough. Okay, accuracy is what matters, not precision. So in this case, we talk about precision, whether it's your internal metrics you're monitoring, whether it's industry statistics. Precision is not important. What is important is the accuracy of that data to make sure that it's close enough and that it got the point across. So if it's a 0.55 or a 0.65, it's good enough. Okay? And make sure you're correctly reflecting the size of what you're actually measuring. This is the #1 issue we saw with industry data. We get these Verizon business reports, we get all this stuff out from the industry, we go back to our offices or cubes, we start adapting it to our environment, and the first thing the guy says is, well, they're not the same company as us, or we're different than the rest of the industry. That's what the business says. So immediately all your stats are worthless. All right? All because you didn't apply things properly to what you're doing. So what we saw, the ones that were most successful at this, is they used repeatable metrics from within their own organization. easy metrics, things that you can pull up within 2 minutes of having a conversation. Now that does mean that you could pull those up easily because you're tracking them very well, or it also could mean that it's just an easy metric to measure. Metrics that we found very complex to measure were the ones that were immediately thrown off as either gobbledygook or you're trying to just make up numbers to prove a point. Because immediately they look at this as if it's complex, it's risky. So if your analysis and your details of your variables are complex, that means it's risky, they don't want to have any interest in it. So the number one thing that we saw back when we interviewed these CSOs and we said, okay, these are the ones that we like. We think they're doing very well when it comes to both managing security, having buy-in from management. We said, can we talk to your managers? Can we go talk to the COOs, the CFOs, the people you're actually dealing with? Let's ask them what you do well. And they all said one thing, communication. They made it easy for me to understand. None of them said, he's great at explaining, how this is a great, high-risk issue and we need to fix it, et cetera. What they did is they said they're good at actually communicating things. So the first issue you see is that talking about numbers and risk is very hard. Okay, we started taking parallels from other industries like life insurance industries, auto insurance industries. They have this hard time of trying to sell you on insurance, which is very similar to security. You're buying something in case something happens. And so we said, what do insurance companies do when they're in the sales cycle to try to sell you? And the first thing we saw is that they communicate the proposition very easily. And so you don't get the situation where you're talking to an executive who says, well, Mike, it didn't happen last year, it won't happen this year. We can go ahead and just, not put that into budget, okay? And everybody's focusing on keeping their budget just on maintenance, no new expenditures. But when I went out and talked to a couple life insurance salesmen and said, hey guys, tell me how you sell this stuff. I want to know what the insides are. They said the number one thing is scenarios. And we didn't see that trend when we looked through the previous data, but we saw when we looked at these PowerPoint presentations after I talked to the life insurance guy, holy cow, these CSOs and these directors of security were totally using scenarios the entire time. And they weren't just using scenarios from the industry. They were picking people in the executive team. So if you had a team of 5 people, say the CFO was there, it would be CFO, Tom, he's the guy that sends out the funny emails, okay? You know that guy, you have one. He sends out the funny email or whatnot, even though it may or may not be work appropriate. He was that guy in that little group, okay? So he used him as an example about how, hey, what if somebody else sent out a funny email on your behalf? Wouldn't everybody open it because they're used to that from you? He built off that to do a whole case on why they needed data leak prevention, all from that one simple example. But because it was a scenario that was related to the environment he was in, he had everybody's attention, everybody understood it, and it was very simple. Okay? And life insurance is the same thing. When they're talking to you about, oh, you're going to die in 5 years or whatnot, is your kid's going to be safe? They're using scenarios that are directly linked to your life. And yet we saw presentations where they would say, in the university sector, Cornell College has this type of risk exposure. And this is a different university, and the CSO is using a different university's risk profile to explain why they should invest in his project. Totally not linked to the business at all. Okay? Now, you're also not a salesperson, though, but you end up having to sell security to a degree, which is a problem, because most engineers don't like to be salespeople. And also, you haven't been educated on how to communicate. No security courses or class talk about communication at all, no matter what university you're in. They don't explain how to make complex things simple. So you have all these different pieces here. And so what I want to wrap up with and actually go to questions, because I found that as I've talked with people, mostly everybody has questions rather than just listening to me. A couple key things came out of this data, and we're going to be releasing a 40-page report on this with really detailed data in about 2 months from Information Week. So you can go ahead and look for that. This is kind of like a precursor to it. So the first question we asked you have to ask yourself is, how do you use industry data? If it is in anything that you show an executive or anybody that makes a decision, you're doing it wrong, plain and simple. Okay? Industry data is the number one mechanism we found that people throw out your case of why it's actually important. Because they immediately, like I said, it's not us, we're not them, we're not a part of the industry, we're different, we're better, we're whatever. And so they take industry data and they just ignore you. But where industry data is important is in actually helping you prioritize what your concerns should be. So keep them in your cube. Keep them in your office. When you're dealing with things in your team, that's what industry data is important. But you don't need to use it as your communication tool. Do you relate every security to a business objective? We had a bank that I talked with Great example. He had wanted to roll out automated patch management. It was going to be a very, very, very large project and a very long time from a resource perspective. He had gotten pushback and things like that from his initial talks. He did two things that were pretty interesting. First, he changed the way he decided to communicate the actual message completely. He said, you know what? I looked at our business objectives and we want to open 4 branches, every couple of months for the next X number of years. And we just heard back from the Fed, who's going to be auditing us, that if we don't fix some of these issues, that they may put an injunction for our capability to actually open our branches. Okay, and what the Fed was looking at was X, Y, Z, and Y was the fact that our patches aren't up to date because our guys are overworked. So what I want to do is I want to implement this program which solves Y, which means the Fed's happy, which means we open our 4 branches. Okay, he started the conversation like that. It's a completely different way than talking about, oh my gosh, rampant malware out there is infecting machines that don't have patches. The average patch latency in a business is 40 days, blah, blah, blah. Totally different way, and completely change it. Now, this gentleman, although he had great, presentation and whatnot, he didn't get the idea to do all that just by himself. The person he actually talked to was the VP of marketing. Okay, we saw, this was another interesting trend that we saw, is those who are at the top of their game from a security perspective leveraged other people in the business to help with their case. So in this case, we've actually saw a couple CSOs who use marketing people to say, hey, can you take a look at my presentation and see if there's any way you could simplify it? That's what marketing people do, right? They take a complex thing, simplify it so people will buy it. And that helped him simplify his proposition and simplify his scenarios when he went to position this project. Second thing that third thing that we saw was reduced risk, okay? Everybody seems to focus on risk, whether they're doing a quantitative approach with numbers and metrics with impact and probability, et cetera, or they're just doing a red, green, yellow, high, medium, low approach. All of those that use risk as their main communication metric, again, the executive teams and management didn't seem to listen too well, okay? What really was important was that the fact that the risk was high, medium, or low isn't too much of a concern. It's the probability of that risk that really matters to the organization. Is this going to happen tomorrow, or is this going to happen in 3 years? And many times we saw pretty strategic projects, when they'd go in, they look at the risk. The strategic project wasn't necessarily solving a high-risk item, maybe a medium or a low-risk item, but it was a high probability item of it actually occurring. So the situation that I have to talk about is, if you have a low probability item or a high probability item that's medium to low risk, you get a couple of those and you immediately have a very high-risk situation. Okay, so focus on probability. Lastly, your numbers are a point in time. They don't show those internal trends. So when you're looking at those repeatable measurements, like I mentioned, if you can easily trend those before you're even talking to the executive management team, you'll completely discredit any arguments they have of saying, well, that just was because of last week's rushed orders, or that was because of this. So you can start trending some things. And then lastly, we saw a pretty interesting thing, which was if you have IT involved in any strategic planning meetings and IT's heading any projects, they ended up failing. Okay, so let me clarify that. What I meant is, if it was a strategic project and IT was actually spearheading it, meaning managing the meetings, getting involved because IT had a vested interest in it, it usually just fell on its face. What we saw was companies implementing committees, usually of say 3 to 5 people, where the business was all involved and there was one IT person. And he translated from the business speak to the tech speak, okay? And that's all he did, was just translate things. Now, IT had great involvement and reward out of these programs, but by having the business make majority of decisions and spending most of their time educating the business, those projects never got unfunded, were much more successful, and usually were adopted by the business as acceptable, safe practices, as opposed to, look at the Gestapo coming in on me trying to do something, okay? So that's it, all I had for a last piece there. Like I said before, there's going to be a lot more information forthcoming. We found lots of interesting data, also on what metrics were very successful too. So do look out for that report. But any questions at all from a high level? No, thank you. Go ahead. So the question was, you have accuracy and probability, and those two together can be difficult to measure over time and be accurate on, right? And so what we saw is actually it's all about your internal measurements. So what you can't control industry data or things outside of it, but you can control your internal measurements. And so when it comes to probabilities, people do not look at security like they do disaster recovery, but they should. We have seen companies simulate fake disasters, fake virus outbreaks, et cetera, to get some of those probability metrics. So you want to, hey, you're having an argument or debate on how probable this is, go try it out in a small segment of the network and see how probable it actually was. That will give you, your information that you need. Any other questions at all? No? Oh, go ahead.
You talked about the balanced scorecards. Have you been provided with any examples from your survey responders, and is that something that you can sanitize and make and share with others?
So the question was, with the balanced scorecard approach, was there any templates I saw or anything that I could give back to the community? Very on-time point, I actually had a discussion with the editor of Information Week last week about doing exactly that. Nobody in our survey used the balanced scorecard like I mentioned, but a couple people that did interview outside that I researched did. We asked them if we could modify some of those or come up with our own. So we're probably going to be releasing them either with that report or a supplemental by the end of the year or some of those type of things. I personally, within my own IT consultancy business, have been using the balanced scorecard for years. I just never linked up anything until I started really diving deep in the survey. But we have been implementing something very similar to it for our clients for years. So we have some of that too that we can leverage. Go ahead. Right. So the question was, a lot of companies are talking about compliance and how there's a difference between being in compliant and being truly secure. And you're 100% right. If the only argument you ever have is, does it matter for compliance, that means you have an immediate education issue. And not an education issue from a security perspective. I'm talking about an education of what your value is to the business. So when I talk to a CSO who mentions that to me, Mike, the only hammer I have is compliance. And of course, when you only have one hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if you've met your compliance requirements and you passed your audit, why are you there, right? And so the question I said back to him was, well, we need to start looking at you from a strategic perspective. How does security help the business? So in this case, it was an actual SaaS provider. And I told them, you know what, you can start using marketing or security within your marketing and start tracking some things. Can you work with the sales team, for example, and say, hey, if we build some marketing literature about our security processes, can you start tracking if that helps you close deals? Okay, so over about an 8-month period, he went back to the board and said, listen, we did a little survey and come to find out we got this really big banking customer because we opened the kimono a little bit about our security processes and they saw what we did and they liked it. And so, that was a thing that led to sales. So now security is not just there as a, compliance requirement checkbox, it's enabling sales, right? It's enabling marketing's capability and things like that. So I always tell people, you're always stuck in the forest. So you got to step out. Compliance is a good thing from an idea perspective because it's supposed to help ensure that, customers are protected, et cetera, et cetera. We seem to lose sight of that sometimes. And most of the reasons why consumers like compliance requirements is it's protecting them. Yet we don't tell consumers how we're protecting them, right? And things like that. So I would say you want to take a step back and look at what are the other things that are important to the business that you can do that can help them. There's another great example too, not to get too long-winded, but they had an issue with salespeople leaving the organization and stealing customers. So they went in and he sold a DLP email archiving project to management because it allowed them to print out exactly what the salespeople were doing before they left to prove in court or not whether they actually stole a sales list. Okay? To that business, that was very important, right? Now he had 15 other issues why DLP was interesting to him, but those were the ones that he leveraged from the business perspective and why the business bought in. So, all right. I'm good, guys. If you have any more questions, you can come see me off stage. Thank you for your time.